Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about what 2Ls and 3Ls should be thinking about as they move into the later years of law school. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Career Conference. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact forum on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about what 2Ls and 3Ls need to be thinking about as they get into the swing of the later years of law school. So let's get started. Probably the first thing that 2Ls and 3Ls think about is how to raise your grades.
That is definitely a big one, to be sure. We get a lot of inquiries from people who said, my first year just did not go the way that I expected it to go. What can I do?
So the first thing is to really figure out what went wrong your first year. And hopefully after your first semester, you were able to meet with your professors about your exams, maybe get copies of your exams if they were available, to try and, get feedback about why you weren't as successful as you'd hoped. But if you didn't do that exercise, then I would highly recommend that you try and do that as soon as you get back on campus. And try and learn from the past experiences. It's amazing that some professors will really sit down and spend quite a bit of time with you to help walk through your exams and help figure out why you weren't as successful as you'd hoped you would be.
Yeah, absolutely. We have an entire episode on this, in fact, which we'll link to in the show notes with a lot of more detailed information. But I don't think, obviously you can't correct a problem until you know what the problem is. So I think people need to do some self-reflection in terms of what happened. It's almost like doing a post-mortem if you do a project in a business. Like, what happened in the past that resulted in these results that you're not happy with? And sometimes people just have an unrealistic idea of what the curve is.
Right.
I get people who are like, I only got A minuses. It's like, you're doing pretty well.
Right.
I don't really know what you were expecting here, but this is a curve and not a lot of people get A's and almost no one gets straight A's. So it's important to be realistic. But, a lot of people are kind of in that middle of the curve section, and they're not doing horribly. They're not on academic probation, but they're also not where they want to be and not getting, the opportunities that they might be getting if they were doing better. So I think it's completely legitimate that people want to raise their grades. And I think there's a lot of potential support that's available, everything from your professors to possibly academic support programs at your school. If you haven't gone and talked to those people, they're probably going to have some useful resources for you. So I don't think it's, useful necessarily to sit around with your friends and be like, I don't know why I got a C in contracts. Do you have any idea why I got a C in contracts? Because they're going to be like, no, I have no idea why you got a C in contracts. Can we talk about something else?
Yep.
Also, it's weird because people never want to talk about their grades, even, among their close friends, which I think is completely neurotic. But, it is what it is, law school.
Yep. That's very true. And I think one of the things that I definitely notice when talking to people who are 3Ls or who are more worried about the bar exam is that if you're struggling in your first year classes and there are some problems with your writing, if you ignore those problems and maybe you just start to take different classes that you don't really have to take exam answers, or you just say, hey, I'm just in the middle or the bottom of my class, that's just where it is. Yeah, that's a problem.
Someone in my family said to me, oh, well, I guess I'm just a B student in law school.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, well, if you're okay with that, I hope that when it comes time to study for the bar, you're going to be, a passing bar student, but we'll see.
Right. Or when it comes time to interview for jobs and they ask about your academic history and you just say, well, I was a B student and I was good with it.
Which is fine. Whatever. It is what it is. If you're happy with that, you're happy with that.
Yeah. But I think
But you're probably not going to impress too many people with that attitude.
That's true. And I do think that a lot of people underestimate how those core 1L classes are just such a good indicator of whether or not you're going to struggle in the bar. So you really do need to take a moment if the first year was really problematic for you, and remember that those courses, that information, that type of essay exam is going to come back to haunt you when you graduate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, bulk of what you're going to be tested on the bar exam is from that first year. So, logically speaking, if you had a lot of problems, you might want to deal with those well in advance of your 2-month crash course.
Yes, for sure. Because there's not a lot of time in your 2-month crash course to really identify and work out, real writing problems. Because you've got to learn all the law. That's a lot to do.
Yeah, so I think if you struggled consistently in your first year classes, you probably have some writing issues that you need to work on. And this might mean taking an advanced legal writing class. It might mean getting help from academic support. It might mean getting a tutor who can really work with you personally to say, okay, this is what you personally really need to work on. But you don't want to not do anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like if you don't think about it, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, these things don't magically resolve themselves, and if you've got issues with issue spotting, or if you know that your writing is jumbled and disorganized, and you're getting that type of feedback, these are things to deal with now.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've got some helpful episodes on a lot of the stuff about thinking about the bar exam and also about dealing with disappointing grades. So we'll make sure that we link to those so you can go back and listen to those for more information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing people are really curious about strategies for in their upper years of law school are how to pick your classes. I mean, you go from this scenario where your first year, almost everything is completely dictated for you. You're just told to show up at this point, take these classes, take these professors. You have almost no choice typically. But then suddenly your second and third year, you can basically do whatever you want. Yeah. So how are people supposed to navigate this? Like, what should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I think this is really challenging. And a lot of people even think, some schools make you pick classes over the summer, and then they get to school and they think, well, I guess I picked my classes. But you still have flexibility once you start classes to add and drop classes or try things out. So you do want to come at it from a fresh perspective when classes start. But I think looking forward for your 2L and 3L year, it's very important to start thinking about, what are your goals? So one should be to be prepared for the bar. So you've got to take bar electives. You don't need to take them all your 2L year, and you don't need to take them all your 3L year. There are pros and cons to spreading them out. There are pros and cons to leaving some till later in your academic career, things like corporations and evidence and kind of the larger, more robust bar classes. A lot of people like to leave them till the end so they can deal with them right before the bar. But you do want to kind of spread them out because full semesters of just bar classes are pretty miserable for most people in law school, and it kind of feels like retaking your first year. So if you do have some flexibility, you want to think about areas of career interest or classes that you have heard great things about and try and mix it up a little bit so you can get excited about some of your coursework.
Yeah, I think, it's important to really consider what type of classes you're taking. You don't want to take all of your really, really hard classes in one semester. If you're taking Fed Courts, for example, that's typically a pretty difficult class. So you don't want to take that if you're also taking, 3 or 4 serious bar electives plus some other really heavy class. Mm-hmm. There are ways that you can, sort of massage your schedule a little bit. So maybe if you know that you're going to have some really serious exam classes, maybe you take a paper class because then, you're probably not going to be under as much pressure to do a ton of reading for every class. You're not going to be under pressure in the study period to prepare for that exam. I mean, obviously you've got to write the paper, so you've got to factor that in. Again, you want to be careful with how many paper classes you take. Like one semester, I kind of accidentally signed up for 3 paper classes, and one of them was twice as long as I thought it was.
Oh, brutal.
So, I'm kind of at the end of the semester, writing and think, gosh, I really feel like I should be finished. Mm-hmm. And then realized that I'd miscalculated the page length to word count. And I was like, oh my God, this is not a 10-page paper. This is a 20-page paper. So I'm writing 60 pages in a couple of weeks. I mean, the upside was during the exam period, I barely had any exams. But
yeah.
Sometimes I think paper classes can be a little bit of a crutch too, like we were talking about earlier. Yes, you can raise your grades if you're not the greatest writer under pressure, but are you really preparing yourself for the type of writing you need to do later on the bar? Probably not. So if you find that you're avoiding exams entirely, I think you might want to rethink that position.
Yeah, I think that that's true. Another thing you want to start thinking about as you look ahead is whether or not you want to do clinics, externships, or internships. And one, if there are prerequisites from classes that you need to take in order to do those. But two, when are you going to take time to do those? It's probably good to start meeting with people and looking at those opportunities and figuring out where they're going to fit into your schedule. I mean, for instance, I was on the law review board. You couldn't we were prohibited from being off campus like for an entire semester doing an externship because we were required to be on campus for that role. So people, if they wanted to do that and they thought they wanted to also do on the law review board, they had to do that in their 2L year. So there is a lot of juggling and thinking ahead that you really need to do.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes with clinics, it's not necessarily the case that you just show up and sign up for a clinic and you get in it. I mean, I think would be pretty rare. So there probably are sort of like competitive admissions requirements for a lot of these clinics. And I know at my law school, oftentimes people would apply as a 2L, not really expecting to get into the clinic that they wanted, but it gave them a leg up when they applied as a 3L. So, it's important to really be realistic and not just kind of assume like, oh, I'll just sign up for a clinic whenever I feel like it.
Right.
Like maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, but you need to understand that process. And typically there'll be some sort of, do you think you want to take a clinic type of presentation? It's important to go to those and really understand the process. And it probably varies. Some clinics are probably more popular than other ones. But the same thing with externships and internships. Are these competitive? If they are competitive, how competitive are you? And, are there ways to make yourself more competitive so that maybe you apply once, you don't get it, you apply again, but you don't plan your whole life around like having this clinic experience the final semester of your 3L year, but you've never looked into how this is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Some of the best advice I got about classes was actually from a professor of mine who was a mentor, and I asked him about what classes to take, and he actually said he thought that taking professors that you thought you would learn something from was more important than the actual classes itself. And I think that that's definitely worth considering. There were some classes where I knew I was not going to get much out of it and I didn't have to take it. So I opted to take something else or take a different professor. And I took some classes that were a bit oddball. They weren't necessarily some typical electives, but they were with professors that I really, really learned from. And I got so much out of taking those classes by getting to study under those professors and work on papers with those professors that they were really worth it. So I don't think you have to take every single class and think, oh, this is part of my trajectory to do X, Y, and Z. I think you also can use classes as an opportunity to get exposure to some really incredible professors that may in some ways be life-changing in your, legal education.
Right. And I think you also have to think about who are going to be your mentors and or your recommenders. So if you think you're going to apply for a clerkship, for example, you need some pretty strong letters of recommendation. One way to get those is to take, a couple of classes with the same professor and to impress that person. So you can be strategic about, I really enjoy this person's classes. I enjoy the things they typically teach about. I think that I always get something out of it. And then, you can start going to office hours and kind of be, you become that person where they're like, oh, this person seems interested in this area, whatever their area is. And professors tend to teach in certain areas. Like one of my people who was my mentor taught a bunch of stuff about international law. So it was like EU law and also like, international arbitration and all this sort of stuff. But there were people who showed up in those classes repeatedly and became friendly with him. And, then he was like, oh, I'll supervise your law review note or whatever it is. So, but rather than just kind of doing this scattershot approach of like, oh, I'll take this class and this class and this class. Like you can think about who am I building those relationships with, because that's an important part of law school.
I think that's very true. I think that's a very good point. What about just knowing what your graduation requirements are? I feel like a lot of people have no idea what they need to have to graduate.
A surprisingly high number of law students in their third year, if you ask them, appear to have literally no idea what they need to do in order to graduate, which one would think would be one of the key things that you're paying attention to in your final year of school, which is your final year to fulfill these requirements without spending more money. So things like Do you need to take a professional responsibility course? If yes, have you signed up for that course? Another big one is the writing requirement. Most schools have some sort of extensive writing requirement, and you need to figure out how you're going to fulfill that.
So one thing I think people forget about with the writing requirement is how brutal it can be to do it the last semester of school.
Oh God, you do not want to be doing that.
No, and I had so many friends who did leave it to the last semester of school, and it's misery.
It's horrible. And also, what if it doesn't get approved?
Yeah, that's terrible.
You want to have time to get this done and get it signed off on and not be worrying about this the day before graduation.
Exactly. And sometimes I've had friends who would get to that last semester and they're clamoring to find a class to even do the writing requirement in.
Yeah, that's just, that's beyond ridiculous. People need to plan ahead on this.
Yes. So that is something you definitely want to find out if it's happening, if it's required, and when you're going to do it, and just put it on the big master calendar and just make sure it gets done.
Yeah, because sometimes things don't work out. You say your requirement is 30 pages and you've realized this topic is just not going to be 30 pages. You need time to regroup from that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also you've got to think about, are there other non-1L required classes? So, for example, maybe you have to take con law, or maybe you have to take evidence, or maybe if you've struggled academically, there are certain things that you're required to do. Again, you want to be sure that you can get into these classes. I've heard horror stories about some class not being taught the final semester when usually it was taught the final semester. And these are just things you've got to plan ahead on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And so, Alison, who do people go to if they have questions about this?
Well, there should be someone the registrar or whoever that person is, the equivalent, who can basically give you a list that says this is what you need to do to graduate.
Right. Yes.
Find that person, get that list, check off the options.
Yep, there's got to be that person somewhere at your school.
Yeah, exactly. So, when you're sitting down to pick your classes, make sure that you have that piece of paper and you're oh, okay, this is how I'm going to spread this stuff out. This is how I'm going to do the writing requirement. This is when I'm going to take professional responsibility. This is when I'm going to take these other things that are required. And again, prerequisites. There may be a prerequisite for something you're required to take, and you want to find that out well in advance of your last semester of law school.
Yeah. One other thing I want to mention is thinking through a bit of math. If you're trying to raise your GPA, it may not be wise to take a bunch of pass-fail classes. Sometimes students like to say, oh, well, now that I'm a 2L, I can take pass-fail classes. But then you might not have very many grades to actually raise your GPA. It depends on how your school calculates your GPA. So if you are trying to raise your GPA and simultaneously take pass-fail classes, again, go to the registrar, make sure you understand how GPA is calculated, and make sure you're not inadvertently doing something to make it harder to raise your GPA.
Yeah, obviously, if you don't get a grade, you don't have the potential to get a good grade.
Right.
That being said, if you don't get a grade, you also don't have the potential to get a really terrible grade.
Yes.
So if there's something that you want to take for some reason, but you know that it's a really difficult class, maybe you take that pass-fail.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't be taking a ton of pass-fail classes if your grades were not what you want. There's also nothing wrong with throwing in some sort of easy A classes. Mm-hmm. One thing people don't necessarily realize all the time is there probably are classes in your law school that are not curved.
Right.
And those can be golden for your GPA.
Yep. Very good point.
Most professors don't like giving out bad grades. Mm-hmm. So given the choice of not having a curve, they tend to give higher grades on average probably than they would in a class that has a strict curve. So, typical examples, it's going to vary by school. You want to see what the rules are. But typical examples, clinics oftentimes don't have a curve. Classes below a certain number of people, like seminars, small seminars often don't have a curve. Mm-hmm. So those can be really good ways to be strategic about raising your GPA.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So the thing is, it's not like law school's happening to you. You can make strategic decisions to set yourself up to make your transcript the best that it can possibly be. If you really want to take Fed Courts and it's more important, and so it's okay, I've got to take Fed Courts, but it's I've got to raise my GPA this semester and it's the hardest class in school, maybe that's not the semester to take Fed Courts.
Yeah, better to take that after you've secured your job or after you've secured your clerkship. That's what I did, to be honest.
Me too.
I took Fed Courts as a 3L because I was I don't want to take this as a 2L when I know I'm going to be applying for other things because maybe, in the end, I did fine. But I didn't know that was going to happen.
Right.
And also, I mean, your 2L year can be super busy if you're doing journal work. So, I was on the law review and knew that was going to take a lot of time. So I didn't want to take a ton of like really difficult classes. So, I actually took a clinic my second year because I looked at it and was like, oh, people tend to do pretty well in this clinic, like grade wise. It takes a lot of credits, so I don't have to take a lot of other stuff. And the way that the academic awards were, sort of like, I don't know, the academic honors were given out. They were given out by year. So my second year, like I really focused on taking classes I thought I could do well in. And then my third year, I took some harder classes because I was like, I want to be able to put, whatever scholar, like the highest one, if that's going to happen, is going to happen my second year. But you just put it on your resume. Right. Nobody looks at it that carefully. They're like, oh, great. Like you were a, whatever it is, fifth scholar or whatever. But, I did definitely like sort of manipulate my classes a bit to make sure that had a good possibility of happening.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the clinics too. I think something else that a lot of people don't take into consideration, and I was definitely one of those people, is how much time on-campus interviewing can take that first semester. I took an overload of classes and did an intensive OCI experience, and I was definitely burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah, and I think at this point, people need to be thinking about their career stuff, more than probably you were as a 1L. Like your job as a 1L is basically to do as well as you could in your grades, to position yourself as well as you could for career options. But now it's time to really start thinking more carefully about your career. Not, to say you don't have to pay attention to the academics, but I think the focus has to shift at this point.
Yeah, I agree. And you need to just set aside time. I mean, the hours definitely start slipping away quickly, but you have to do some goal setting specifically around your career, maybe even setting weekly or monthly goals about what you want to get done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. It's easy to be like, oh yeah, like I'll figure this out sometime. But just like you hopefully have, some academic goals every week and every month where you're going to devote, X amount of time to getting your outlines done or whatever. I think it's really important to have that sort of structure for your career goals. So, it might be like this week or, if you look at it on a monthly basis, every other week, I'm going to have some sort of thing like going to an event at the Bar Association, taking someone to coffee for an informational interview. These are things you can basically plug in and see if you actually do them. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. Something that we learned when we were throwing conferences was that a lot of law schools will even pay you to go to conferences or pay for you to go to conferences. And, that's something that if that interests you, if you are really focused on a certain area of law, let's say you want to do fashion law, but you're not going to a school that has a fashion law program, but they're doing a fashion law symposium down at Loyola, which I think in Los Angeles, which I think actually does have a fashion law program.
I think so.
Then I bet you can get your school to supplement your costs to go to Loyola and attend that. And
how fun.
Yeah, how fun. You're going to get
trip to California.
Right? You're going to get to meet all these interesting people. You're going to get to network. You're going to get to meet connections. You never know where it could lead, but you have to, allocate time for that. And I think you'd be foolish not to look for those opportunities. If you're really into public interest work and you have an opportunity to go to a conference on setting up nonprofits and that's your goal, then go to that, figure out how to go, because that could be a really big thing for your career.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people don't really think to look outside of the law school bubble for opportunities, but there can be so many opportunities outside of just your law school. So, for example, say there's something you're interested in and you want to join a board of a nonprofit in your community. I know that that's something you've done, Lee, and you said, it's great experience, it's great connections. But also things like writing an article for a journal. Yeah. It doesn't have to be a journal at your school. Like if your school doesn't have a journal in your area of interest, but that journal exists elsewhere, they will probably accept an article, potentially if it's good. They're at least open to accepting an article, or like a moot court, something like that. Or like you said, these conferences, do you want to get involved in the Bar Association on a national level versus just in your community? Both of those can be valuable, but they have all kinds of things that, I think a lot of students just aren't really aware exist.
All right. What about taking time to plan for your job hunt? I mean, I mentioned how much time my OCI experience took for my first semester, but you also need to figure out when you're going to do all these applications, or when you're going to go, try and contact people to find out when you can do interviews, because if you're not doing OCI, you need to hustle to get a 2L and 3L job.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a time where it's important to start thinking about, like, who could help me on this? Like, who can I call that might have a lead on this? But it's going to require really pounding the pavement. I mean, your 2L summer job definitely can really matter a lot. And obviously, if you're a 3L listening to this, the thought that you don't have a job when you graduate is probably at least slightly panic-inducing.
Right.
With good cause. I mean, I don't think people need to panic. And in a lot of cases, realistically, you're not going to necessarily get a job until you've passed the bar. But you want to be laying the groundwork for, what are you going to be doing, even if it's after you've taken the bar and you're waiting for your results for 2 months. Like, what can you do in those period of time? So, if you're 2L, I think focusing on that 2L summer job is absolutely critical. And if you're 3L, at least thinking through, like, what are my options? How am I going to support myself if I can't find a job before I graduate?
I think that's a good point. And, some people I knew in law school, they worked part-time, even for pay, not necessarily as a clerkship or an internship, for law firms to try and get into the door, to try and just work 1 day a week or something like that at a law firm that might consider hiring them as an associate after they graduated. I mean, there are lots of different creative ways that you can find your place, especially a lot of solo firms or smaller firms. They can't take the gamble on somebody by giving them an offer. They have to.
I mean, yeah, there's like the big law of the world, which if you can get into, great, and it's very structured. But then think about it. If you're a firm of like 3 or 4 people and you have some overflow work, but you're probably not going to hire someone who's just graduated and hasn't passed the bar.
Right.
But you might hire that person as a law clerk, as you said, for, a day or 2 a week. And that can be a really great way to get experience, to get connections, to possibly make some money. Never a bad thing.
Right.
But you just want to be thinking through, like, you can't, and sometimes I think people just get so overwhelmed with this that they just kind of stick their head in the ground and like, I'll just deal with it later. But later is going to come sooner than you think.
That's very true. And you mentioned that I've done some work on nonprofit boards, and I think that the nonprofit world and volunteering in general is a really untapped resource for law students as far as networking and thinking outside of the box. I think that you can meet a lot of really incredible people who you have a similar interest to that are in all different walks of life. And you never know which networking connection is going to lead to a job opportunity. I mean, one, a lot of lawyers do volunteering, so that's part of it.
Yeah.
But also, you're going to meet people who are work in tech companies and do nonprofit work or work for investment banks, and they all have networks. And if you're saying, "Wow, I'm really hunting for a job in immigration law," you might be able to reach outside of your small network at the law school, and somebody's going to be like, "Oh, one of my friends from college practices immigration law. Let me connect you." And you just have no idea where those connections might go. So besides getting to give back to the community, which is, of course, a great benefit of doing volunteer or nonprofit board service, it also really mixes up your networking pool in a way that can be pretty awesome, both from a friendship perspective, from a mentor perspective, but also as a job opportunity perspective.
I think that's right. And I think pro bono work can also be a really good way to make connections within the legal community, but outside of your law school. So, for example, when I was thinking about transitioning out of big law and I thought, maybe I want to do family law, I took on a divorce case, and largely I did that because I wanted to try it out, hated it, but B, because when you sign up for that, they give you a multi-page list of people who are willing to mentor you, which just happens to be basically all of the top divorce lawyers in the city. So, obviously as a law student, you may be a little bit more limited in what you can take on. But I think that is an amazing way to spend time that both gets you practical experience, but also gets you connections and mentors and things like that can really be beneficial going forward. So, rather than just spending all of your time as a 2L and 3L in the library, I think people have to be thinking about, how am I going to get out there? How am I going to start making those connections, getting that experience? Because again, people can't afford to take a risk on someone who's never, done, if you want to be a litigator, you've never seen discovery responses.
Yep.
That makes it really hard to hire you.
Yep.
There's just like a certain level of basic knowledge and experience that if you have it, makes you so much more compelling as a job candidate than someone who's just been spending their time in the library.
Yeah, I agree. And as we've talked about, you've also got to think forward towards the bar exam. We talked about this a bit with your classes that you need to consider taking and things like that. But you might be getting a lot of pressure to sign up for a bar review course. You don't have to. But you should start learning about them. You should be trying out different bar review courses to help you study for things like the MPRE. They're likely going to give you access for free to stuff like that. So
the MPRE, another critical element.
Yes.
That is definitely something you don't want to leave to the end. I know people at Columbia who failed the MPRE the first time they took it. So I actually did wait until the very last minute to take it, and it was way more stressful than it needed to be because basically I had to pass if I was going to get admitted. So better that you probably take that sooner so that if things don't go well, you can take it again.
Yep, exactly. So you want to set aside time to do that. You want to try out some different bar review tools. You want to figure out how the heck you're going to pay for the bar exam and like live while you're studying for the bar exam. So, figuring out your finances can be really important. But I think, as from a preparation standpoint, I think the best thing you can do is really get comfortable with your study skills and work on your writing skills, as we talked about. If you're struggling with multiple choice, every time you get a multiple choice test to come up in your class, you should take some time to work on multiple choice, because that's really where I think the struggles come with the bar, is that you get there and students are like, well, this was a known problem all through law school, but here I am studying for the bar. We can fix it now, right?
It's like, probably not when you're also trying to learn this incredible volume of information.
Yeah, exactly.
If multiple choice is a problem, better that you get better at that now. If you know that, say, legal writing has been an issue for you, you're probably going to struggle if there's a performance test. So, we need to improve that now.
Yep, exactly. So definitely, focusing on that, using your resources at your school. If they have academic support, oftentimes academic support professors also support bar students. You might have like a coordinator of bar exam services. Use all your resources at your school to make sure that you're set up for success, and don't just walk into the bar one day going like, oh, I signed up for this commercial bar review course because it's what everybody signed up for, and I'm not really sure if it's going to work for me, but I'm going to check the boxes and I'm going to pass, right? Well,
look at the pass rates. Not happening a lot.
Exactly.
And I think more and more schools are trying to prepare students better for the bar exam, and I think that's something for people to take seriously. Sometimes people kind of blow those classes off and think like, oh, I don't need this. Mm-hmm. But this is a serious undertaking and lots of people fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And we do have some more podcasts on the bar. If you are interested in that, we can link to those in the show notes. But definitely something you want to think about. It's not out of sight, out of mind. It's coming whether you like it or not.
Yeah, basically all of your 3 years of law school are for naught if you can't pass the bar. Yeah. So take it seriously. One thing I want to mention on the job front, we get a lot of questions about this, which is clerkships. And when should people be applying? I will answer by referring you to our clerkship podcast on this topic. But the short answer is you probably should be applying whenever you're listening to this, because it's completely random at this point.
Mm-hmm. So what if people think they've missed this opportunity? Is it really over, or can they still try and figure out if it's an opportunity for them?
No, I don't think it's over at all. In fact, I think quite the opposite. I think more and more judges are hiring people who are out of school or will be out of school. Say they get hired as a 3L and they're not going to start immediately. They'll start after a year of work. And that could be a really great, pro on both sides, because you get more experience, you're more useful to the judge, but also you get paid more typically.
Yeah.
So I think, apparently fewer people are actually applying for clerkships because the process is such a complete fiasco at this point, and there really isn't a process. So if it's something that you're interested in, I think definitely apply, but probably plan on it being less streamlined than it was before, and you may have to be more flexible. You may have to wait a little while, but it's definitely worth applying, and keep applying if it's something that you're interested in. So check out that podcast. It has tons of great information straight from the NALP conference this year, the latest and greatest information on clerkships. But I just wanted to throw that in because I think that's something that people are really kind of struggling with at this point, just because the process is, so lacking.
Yeah, and that actually links back to what you were talking about earlier about those recommendations from professors and focusing on building relationships with professors, because those letters of recommendation are a critical part of that clerkship process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're going to work for a judge, they want someone to sign off on you. because you're working very closely with them and they're kind of stuck with you for a year. And if you only get to hire between 2 and 4 people, which is very normal, you have serious problems as a judge if one of your clerks is terrible.
Yeah.
So you want someone to sign off, multiple people preferably, on this person is likable, this person is hardworking, this person is competent, I would hire them.
Yeah.
That's what your letter of recommendation should say.
Yeah. And going back to something that we've talked about a lot before in the podcast and on our websites is really defining what success means for you. I think as you look towards your final years of law school, you get to shape your experience. And, if you don't want that big firm job, that's okay. Just figure out what your definition of success is and how you're going to get there so you can feel good about law school as you exit the law school experience.
Yeah, one of my professors said basically the value of the last year of law school particularly is that it gives you time to think about what type of lawyer you would like to be, because once you start practicing, you don't have time to think about that. So, you've got to sort of really get clear on what are my values, what do I find beneficial, what do I want to do in the world. And your second and third year of school can really be a great time to kind of explore those questions and figure out like, what do I want to be doing in my legal career? Because once it starts, you're just kind of thrown in there and you don't really have a whole lot of time to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Well, unfortunately, speaking of time, this episode, we are out of time. So if you enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes because we really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Typically, our episodes come out on Mondays. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and good luck in your final years of law school.